Bon dia. I hope I said that right. Welcome, everybody, to D4, D&D Deep Dive. This is the show where each week we take a deep dive into one, sometimes two, specific characters for Dungeons & Dragons. We theorycraft about them, we crunch numbers, not with the intent to tell you the right way or the only way to play a certain character, but to explore one potential option for playing a character that we build, with the hopes to create something that is both really fun, but also really powerful to play in-game. So, if you enjoy creating characters for D&D almost as much as you enjoy playing the actual game itself, or you're just looking for tips or ideas on a character that you're thinking about playing, welcome home. This is where you belong, and I'm so glad that you're here, so thanks for being here. My name's Colby. Okay, let's just jump right into the build, because I fear we might go long today, and I am really excited about this character. More so than for any build that I've done in a really long time. And I don't want to go over an hour if I can help it, so let's just jump in. And now I've just taken up 10 extra seconds and makes it more likely to go over. I have done, in the past, a couple of builds that are really lightning focused. The Storm Sorcerer Tempest Cleric in particular, I think, but also the Sorcerer with the Magic Touch was kind of lightning themed. I've done one that was at least mostly fire-based anyway, with the Flamethrower Sorcerer, but a build that I have never done before on this channel and have wanted to do for a very long time, and somewhat surprisingly to me have had a ton of requests for actually as well, is to do a cold-based caster character. A magic user who is all about harnessing the powers of snow and ice to harm and freeze their enemies. It's a super compelling concept, and I'm really excited to finally tackle it today. Better yet, I'm going to be doing so by taking most of my levels in a subclass that I've never used before, and that's always a lot of fun. Now, I suppose if you really wanted to, probably the easiest way to make like a cold-based caster character would be to just go Scribe's Wizard, right? Make sure you get a spell that does cold damage at every single spell level, and now you can just change the damage type of any spell you cast to cold damage. Voila. But, I don't know, that kind of feels like cheating to me. More importantly, for me anyway, the appeal of playing a character like this is not just to always be doing cold damage necessarily, it's to be casting spells that do things that you would expect a cold-based spell to do, right? And that actually brings me to a little bone that I have to pick with 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I really wish that Wizards of the Coast would have done a little more to make spells of different damage types do different things a little more consistently. It's perhaps one of the things that I most hope to see out of the next version of D&D that's set to come out in 2024, whether it's 6 or probably more likely 5.5. A lot of spells currently that do poison damage also inflict the poisoned condition. Awesome. I wish all poison-based spells would do so, frankly. Even if it meant a little less damage. I wish that all spells that did fire and probably even acid damage too would inflict like a burning condition that would do a little bit of damage over time every round to the character. There are a couple of spells in-game currently that do that, but not a lot. I wish lightning spells would inflict like a shocked condition that, I don't know, maybe would reduce the enemy's attack by a d4 until they made a saving throw or something. Just make it a little more interesting with spells and the different damage types that they do, you know? With cold damage spells, there are a few spells in the game that inflict cold damage and then reduce move speed, or sometimes stop a creature altogether. I wish they all would do something like that. But those are the types of spells that we're going to be focusing on with this character. We don't just want to do cold damage because we like cold damage. We want to do things with the cold damage that you'd expect cold spells to do. Slow the enemy down, make them slip on the ice and fall prone, or even freeze them solid, right? Right. And so, yes, the character that we're going to do today is going to be focused on two things. Sustainable damage that you can do without spending a lot of resources round after round, but also control. Similar to the Hammer Time Battlesmith controller build that I did a few weeks ago. And maybe I'll briefly repeat here what I said there. While the damage we put out here might not be spectacular, we're going to do our best to make it at least pretty decent. And actually it ends up being quite a bit stronger than I would have thought when I first started creating the character. But the most powerful thing that we are going to be bringing to the battlefield, I think, won't be our damage necessarily. It will be the way that we can control the battlefield, slowing, snaring, tripping up, and even pushing back our enemies so that we can keep them from hurting us and our allies in the first place on their turn. I mean, think of it this way. If we could build a character who does a little less damage than a purely damage-focused character, but who could reliably prevent one or more enemies from doing anything useful in combat, wouldn't that be a lot more beneficial to your party? Most of the time, it would. So, in the interest of sticking to the theme for this character, I'm going to give myself one single rule. If I do damage to an enemy, I have to do so with cold damage. Or in other words, cold damage must at least be part of the damage that I do, which is different, obviously, than any damage that I do always has to be cold damage. I'm giving myself a little out here for a couple of different spells that I really wanted, and we'll get into it later. And so, I proudly present episode 89, the Fathomless Frost Mage. Big thanks to Randall Hampton for this fantastic artwork that he created for this character. I love it. I love the effects. It really invokes what I imagine a frost mage looking like. Randall's a fantastic artist and is oftentimes open to commission. So if you'd like to just follow him or even reach out to see if you could commission him for a portrait of your own character, I will put links in the video description as always, letting you know how to do so. Big thanks to Randall, and let's jump in. At level 1, for our starting class, we're actually going to start with Sorcerer here. I heavily debated this. The main reasons I'm wanting to start Sorcerer at level 1 are defensive. We get Constitution saving throw proficiency, which is important for our concentration checks, among other things, and some other defensive benefits that we'll get into in a second. You might be asking, if you're picking a class at level 1 for defensive purposes, why not just start as a fighter to get armor and shield proficiency, more hit points, the same Constitution saving throw proficiency, plus a self-heal and a fighting style? That's a good question. I almost did. If you wanted to start fighter, I think it'd be a good option. For me, I plan on taking Sorcerer levels later with this character, and there's a cantrip that I really want that Sorcerers get that our other class does not. So starting Sorcerer felt like a decent compromise between being able to pick up some additional defensive abilities while also not delaying the character progression otherwise. As for our race, this is another thing that I actually got stuck on for quite a while. On the one hand, sure, starting custom lineage would get us a jump on our most important ability score as soon as possible. If we took a half feat that bumped our charisma, we could start with an 18 charisma, and that in and of itself is really nice. That said, there isn't really a feat here for this character that I see as like a must-have to make it work. There are certainly several that I would like to have, but since it can work without any of them, I figured I should take the opportunity to explore something other than custom lineage or variant human. Now, there are certainly some great options for purely mechanical reasons, right? Tortle for a nice beefy 17 armor class to start, Harengon for good initiative rolls and their hop, Mountain Dwarf for great ability score bonuses and medium armor proficiency. That would be really nice. For me though, for this character especially, I wanted to pick something that gives both a nice mechanical advantage, but perhaps even more importantly, works really well with the cold theme that we've got going. For that reason, I think I would go with the Eladrin. And since Monsters of the Multiverse is going to be available to everyone in another week or two at the time of this recording, I'm just going to use the version that's in there. It's not actually that much different than the current version of the Eladrin. The biggest change that we get from Monsters of the Multiverse is to the phase step that Eladrins get. With phase step, as a bonus action, you can teleport 30 feet. It's basically like Misty Step. You could previously use this once per short rest, but now it's PBXPD, proficiency bonus times per day, which is probably better for most of us at most character levels. Also, as an Eladrin, you choose a season that you're affiliated with. Oh, you can choose what you want, of course, but obviously I'm going with winter. And as a winter Eladrin, after level 3, when you use your phase step, one creature who was within 5 feet of you before you teleported away has to make a wisdom saving throw or be frightened of you until your next turn. This provides some really nice escape and control that will come in handy for this build, I think, very often. And of course, it fits perfectly into our Frost Mage theme, I think. As for our ability scores, I am assuming point buy as always and recommend starting with a 15 Charisma, taking a +2 there from our racial bonus, a 15 Constitution and a +1, and then a 14 Dexterity. There is a half feat that I feel pretty strongly about, not quite strongly enough to start custom lineage, but strongly nonetheless. So yeah, we're going with a 17 Charisma to start off so we can bump that to 18 later. As for our starting equipment, pretty basic stuff. We don't have any armor proficiencies. We won't plan on using weapons, so just get whatever you think you'll need. But at level 1, sorcerers get to choose their sorceress origin, their subclass. And we're going to go with Draconic Bloodline. And this is actually the main reason why I wanted to start as sorcerer. It's both for thematic and defensive purposes. As a mage who is totally focused on cold spells, it just seemed fitting to have a cold-based dragon tie to the character right from the get-go. And since I decided against Dragonborn for the race, though that would be a viable option too, I think, this was the best way to do it. So yes, when we first meet our character, they have perhaps recently, I think, discovered that they have dragon blood in their ancestry. I think that since they're known to often take human or elven form, the lineage most likely traces back to a silver dragon. Because yes, as a draconic sorcerer, you first have to choose a dragon ancestor, which is affiliated with a certain damage type that comes into play later, much later for us. But so if it were me, I think I would take a silver, though white is another option, of course. This silver dragon draconic ancestry, I think at least partly explains both our fascination with cold magic and our inherent talent with manipulating it, and maybe also influences the reason why, as an Eladrin, we're constantly in a state of winter. As a Draconic Bloodline sorcerer, then we get Draconic Resilience. It gives us 1 extra hit point for every sorcerer level we have, so instead of a D6, we're basically a D8 character. And also tells us that parts of our skin are covered by a thin sheen of dragon-like scales, which is either really cool or maybe a little creepy, depending on what you're into. But as a result, your armor class equals 13 plus your dexterity modifier when you're not wearing armor. So it's similar to having mage armor up all the time. So yes, right now we'd have a 15 AC, and that's pretty decent for a level 1 sorcerer. But we can also bolster that AC even further thanks to spells. We get spells at first level, of course. Cantrips, first level spells. Yes, I would definitely grab the shield spell, which lets you raise your armor class by 5 as a reaction when you're hit with an attack. And that +5 lasts until your turn, which is just fantastic. I'd probably grab Absorb Elements, I think, here too. It lets you have resistance to elemental damage with your reaction. And it makes sense that our hero would at least be resistant to cold damage, I think, if not the other elemental damage types, maybe thanks to our affiliation with Dragonkind. As for cantrips, I think we at least really need to make sure we pick up Ray of Frost. That's the other main reason I wanted to start Sorcerer, actually. Ray of Frost is a pretty decent little cantrip. It sends a frigid beam of blue-white light streaking towards your target. If it hits, it does 1d8 in cold damage for now. Nothing spectacular, but it does scale like all cantrips. More importantly, if you hit, it reduces the enemy's speed by 10 feet until your next turn. No saving throw or anything for that. And thus we have our first real, this spell does what a cold damage spell should do spell. And minus 10 feet of move speed on an enemy is nothing to scoff at. By itself, it will often prevent an enemy from getting in range to attack you or your allies for at least one turn, forcing them oftentimes to take the dash action just to get in range. And we're going to try to build on that too, to make slowing enemies even more effective. The other first level cold spells that you might want to consider picking up at some point, I think, would be Chromatic Orb for some pretty decent single target burst damage for this level. It's 3d8 for now, which you can make cold damage. And Ice Knife, which does slightly less damage to a single target, but explodes in a small 5-foot area of effect radius upon impact to do a little cold damage to enemies standing near your target. At level 2, though, we're going to make a shift. For you see, your draconic ancestor, it turns out, was perhaps more than just an ordinary silver dragon. if such majestic creatures can be said to be ordinary. They were actually a servant of Bahamut themselves, a powerful demigod in their own right. Also, while yes, they did often take the form of an elf, turns out it was actually a sea elf. They were, perhaps uncharacteristically for a silver dragon, fascinated with all things that live in the ocean. They loved to explore the fathomless deeps. And they have been biding their time, waiting for the latent power in their bloodline to finally manifest itself after lying dormant for many years. And here you are, showing forth great power and potential. Seeing this, they reach out to you with an offer to their descendant. They have a great task for you to perform, an ancient enemy to vanquish, and they are willing to aid you with more of their power if you will agree to take up their quest. So whatever your reasons, yes, we're going Warlock now, and shall be for quite some time. And as a Warlock at level 1, we also get our subclass, our otherworldly patron. And in case you hadn't guessed yet by the title of the episode, yes, we are taking the Fathomless Warlock. And I am really, really excited to be doing this because it's both a subclass that I've never used before and is one that I get a ton of requests to do a build on. I think it's absolutely the perfect chassis for building a control-focused, cold magic-themed character. So let's get into it. First up, as a Fathomless Warlock, we get Gift of the Sea, which tells us that we have a swim speed of 40 feet and can breathe underwater. Pretty nice as ribbon features go. I really hope you're playing in a campaign where you get to use this once in a while. More importantly for us, we get Tentacle of the Deep, which tells us that PBXPD, as a bonus action, I'm just gonna force that acronym on people. At proficiency bonus times per day, you can magically summon a 10-foot long tentacle within 60 feet. I would totally flavor this as like an icy or watery magical creation, I think, as opposed to like something that looks like an octopus. But anyway, when we create it, we can make a melee spell attack against an enemy within 10 feet of it. On a hit, the enemy takes 1d8 cold damage, and their speed is reduced by 10 feet until the start of your next turn. Almost identical to Ray of Frost. It lasts for 1 minute, and on subsequent turns, we can both move it 30 feet and make another attack with it. So already, we are doing really well at accomplishing our goal of being a cold-based damage dealer who provides some nice battlefield control. You can slow 2 enemies by 10 feet each, or a single enemy by 20 feet. Now, if you're attacking a melee enemy who's already engaged with another melee ally, of course, this doesn't do a lot for us. But especially if it's early on in the fight and the enemy is trying to close distance with your party, or if they've been pushed away and they need to move up more than 10 feet to get to one of you, this is a fantastic way from letting them do that. Most enemies have 30 feet of move speed, right? Reducing them to 10 would potentially keep them from being very effective for at least a round, if not more. Super fun. We also get spells as a Warlock 1, of course, and I would say that we for sure need to get at least 2. For cantrips, Eldritch Blast. That doesn't do cold damage. I know, just hold your horses. But also Armor of Agathis as a first level spell. So Eldritch Blast, of course, fires a beam of energy that does 1d10 force damage on a hit, very much not cold damage. So we're not going to be using it yet. The great thing about Eldritch Blast is that unlike most cantrips that do damage, when it scales at levels 5, 11, and 17, it doesn't just do more damage with a single beam, right? It instead fires multiple beams. This means that if you have something that does additional damage every time you hit, or adds an effect every time you hit, it can scale a lot better than something that just fires once but does more damage as it scales, right? As for Armor of Agathis, it's great because it gives us 5 temporary hit points when we cast it, and then if an enemy hits us with a melee attack, they take 5 cold damage in return, so long as we still have those temporary hit points. So we're sort of like covering ourselves in a frosty aura, and I love that. And it scales nicely as well, going up by 5 for both the temporary hit points and the damage that it returns with each additional spell level that you cast it at. The other spell I think I'd consider grabbing here at Warlock 1 is Cause Fear. It doesn't do cold damage, but it doesn't do any damage, so I'm okay with it. It does potentially cause an enemy to be frightened of you, however, if they fail a wisdom save, and that I think works really well thematically for this character, descended from dragons as they are. We're already doing this anyway with our Winter Eladrin Face Step, so we're kind of just leaning into this wintry dragon fear thing. And Frightened can be a pretty nice debuff to put on an enemy, especially one who we're trying to keep out of the fight and keep from moving up towards us and our allies. Because if they are frightened of you, they both have disadvantage on their attacks and their ability checks, but also can't willingly move towards you. So you could frighten one enemy at the start of combat, preventing them from even getting into range since they can't move any closer to you, and then bonus action slow another with your frosty tentacle whip, making it more difficult for a second enemy as well. Oh, and just a reminder, in case you're new to Warlocks, you only have one spell slot for now. You will get another at next level, and they do reset on a short rest. It's both the blessing and the curse of being a Warlock. Mostly a curse, but the reset on a short rest definitely helps mitigate the low number of spell slots. And thankfully, we do have a couple of first level spell slots from Sorcerer too that we can use daily to help mitigate this pain. At level 3, we would be a Warlock 2, and we get Eldritch Invocations, and there are so many invocations that I want for this build, but for now, since I've sworn off Eldritch Blast, I'm just going to say pick your favorites, PYF. We'll get into the ones that are important for us in a minute. At level 4, we would be a Warlock 3, and we get our Pact Boon. And my preference is Pact of the Chain, because Pact of the Chain lets us summon a familiar via the Find Familiar spell, and additionally lets that familiar take a more powerful option than the spell typically allows. For me, as much as I would love to have a pseudo-dragon for thematic purposes, I think I'd have to go with the Quasit, or the Imp, as both of them can go invisible. The primary purpose for the familiar will be utility, scouting and things, and then in combat, of course, having them take the help action to give you advantage on what would be your Ray of Frost spell currently. The nice thing about invisibility, of course, is that it's not broken when you take the help action. So your familiar should be able to run in, pull the enemy's hat down over their eyes, or tickle their bum or whatever, right? And then run away without taking an opportunity attack, since you have to be able to see a creature in order to take an opportunity attack against them. So that will help your familiar stay safe. We also get second level spells now, and there are lots of great options. Hold Person or Suggestion for nice control potential. Misty Step, of course, for getting around the battlefield. I mean, being able to have this and Phase Step would be really nice. Invisibility, Flock of Familiars, so everyone can have advantage. Maybe Darkness if you took the Devil's Sight invocation. Nothing that I'm going to plan on using for sustained DPR necessarily, so pick your favorites. At level 5, we would be a Warlock 4, and we get our first ability score increase or feat. And I'm going to suggest taking Elven Accuracy. Now, the truth is, we're only getting advantage on a single attack per turn, thanks to our familiar, and that attack doesn't hit all that hard. That said, it's going to be really important for us tactically to land one of our attacks in particular during our turn. I'll explain more in a second when we get into the damage report. So I do think this feat is pretty important for this build. And the fact that we can bump our charisma by 1 when we take it makes it that much better, meaning yes, we now have an 18 charisma. With Elven Accuracy, if you make an attack with Dexterity, Intelligence, Wisdom, or Charisma and have advantage on that attack, you get to roll 3 d20s instead of 2, and that just does fantastic things for our accuracy. But level 6, we'd be a Warlock 5, and this is where it kind of all comes together. First up, we get third level spells. Counterspell is almost a must-have, I think. Fear and Fly and Hypnotic Pattern are all fantastic, but for me, there are 3 standouts for this build. First, Hunger of Hadar. It requires concentration, so I think I would only use it very situationally myself, but it covers a 20-foot radius sphere, pretty big area, in darkness and cold, making the area difficult terrain and dealing 2d6 cold damage to enemies who start their turn there, and 2d6 acid damage on a failed dexterity saving throw as milky, otherworldly tentacles rub against them. I think I would allow this spell for this build because, like I said, as long as at least part of the damage we do with a spell is cold, it's permissible for me. But also, this can really be a great control spell, especially on an enemy who's already slowed, right? Difficult terrain means half move speed, and if they've already been slowed by 10 or 20 feet, it's going to be very difficult for them to get out of the area of effect, and it means they probably are going to be taking both forms of damage and that they'll be stuck inside for at least one turn. That said, the flavor of this spell feels just a little off for me for this character. I mean, you might disagree. You are a Fathomless warlock after all, but I guess I'm just kind of wanting to lean a little more into the cold aspect of what we do and a little less into the tentacle aspect. If you're going to use this, and I think it would be tactically very sound, I would make sure to have the Devil's Sight invocation so that you can see the enemies who are inside the area of effect of the spell, right? Something I love even more for this build, though, is Sleet Storm. Sleet Storm is not available to most warlocks, but as a Fathomless warlock, it's available to us. And it's not a spell that I've ever talked about before in any build, surprisingly, kind of, because it is really good. The same goes for Hunger of Hadar, I guess, that today is just a day of firsts. Now, Sleet Storm also requires your concentration. So many good concentration spells that I want. But when you cast it, it covers a 40-foot radius in a 20-foot tall cylinder in freezing rain and sleet. That is a huge area. The ground is covered with thick ice, making it difficult terrain also. And when a creature starts their turn in the area or enters the area for the first time on a turn, similar wording to Moonbeam and Spirit Guardians, right? They have to make a dexterity saving throw or fall prone. They would also have to make a concentration check if they're concentrating on a spell. So just imagine, on your turn, you use a bonus action to Chilly Tentacle Whip an enemy, reducing their move speed by 10, and then you throw Sleet Storm on top of them. On their turn, they're probably knocked prone and only have 20 feet of move speed. They use half of it to stand up, right? So now they have 10 feet of move speed, and they're surrounded in all directions by 40 feet of difficult terrain. They can move 5 feet. They still have 35 to go. They're basically stuck. And once Sleet Storm is down, I mean, if you have 2 creatures in the area, you could Ray of Frost one of them and then use your tentacle attack on a second. This is super fantastic. Huge area of effect, really powerful form of control for enemies who need to get up close to your party to be effective. But for me, for sustained damage purposes at least, I'm actually going to assume that we are using the Spirit Shroud spell for our concentration when I crunch numbers. With Spirit Shroud, you cast it as a bonus action, and then for 1 minute, any attacks you make deal an extra 1d8 of damage that can be radiant, necrotic, or, you guessed it, cold. Now, the enemy has to be within 10 feet of you to get this bonus damage, so it can get a little tricky for a ranged character like us, but also, any character who starts their turn within 10 feet of you has their move speed reduced by 10 feet. That will be really nice if, despite all of your slow effects, an enemy still manages to get close to you. You could, on your turn, phase step away, blast them with more cold slowing damage. They have -10 from starting their turn close to you, and if you hit them with both Ray of Frost and your tentacle, their move speed might be 0 on their turn. Oh, and they might even be feared. Maybe save the fear. Well, no. Use the fear on a second target if you've got one. Sucks to be them. One last thing. Any creature who takes damage from Spirit Shroud can't regain hit points until the start of your next turn, so that could be situationally useful as well. Overall, this is a really solid spell. Now, one thing to note. You should be able to apply Spirit Shroud damage to your Tentacle of the Deep's attack. Spirit Shroud says it applies the damage on any attack you make if the enemy is within 10 feet of you. And the description of Tentacle of the Deep says you can make a melee spell attack against one creature, as opposed to, say, giving the tentacle its own stat block or saying it makes an attack using your spell chance to hit, etc. Now, obviously, you or your DM may argue that the tentacle doesn't count as you here for purposes of Spirit Shroud, and if so, that's fine. I think rules as written, it works, and I'm going to assume when crunching numbers that we can apply it. Modify accordingly if that's not the case at your table. But the thing that would make Spirit Shroud really shine would be to start using Eldritch Blast at this level. And if we have cold damage from Spirit Shroud being applied to every one of our Eldritch Blast attacks, I would 100% allow it to be used on this character. Now they're just icy Eldritch Blasts, right? Of course, what makes Eldritch Blast so good are our invocations. So at 5th level, we get a 3rd invocation, and since we can swap out 1 invocation every time we gain a level in Warlock, make sure you've been prepping to this point so that we now have the following 3 invocations. Agonizing Blast, which lets us add our Charisma modifier and damage to each of our Eldritch Blast beams. And remember, that went up to 2 beams when we hit level 5. Repelling Blast, which lets us push an enemy 10 feet away from us if we hit them with an Eldritch Blast. No size restrictions, no saving throw. If we hit them, they are pushed. Here's hoping you often find yourself fighting gargantuan enemies, standing on the edge of big, huge cliffs. And then for the 3rd invocation, Lance of Lethargy, which lets us only once per turn, unfortunately, when we hit them with an Eldritch Blast, reduce an enemy's move speed by 10 feet. So now we've got something that's very similar to Ray of Frost, both tactically and thematically, but it just hits a lot harder and can push enemies as well. And so at level 6, it's time for our first damage report, and let's go over how I envision it all working. When combat starts, you ideally would want to get within 10 feet of an enemy, cast Spirit Shroud with your bonus action, and then let fly with 2 of your icy Eldritch Blasts. You're going to want your invisible familiar to ready their help action to use as their reaction after the first Eldritch Blast is fired, if possible. The reason is this. You're going to want to wait to push them with Repelling Blast until that 2nd Eldritch Blast, since if they get pushed away on the first Eldritch Blast, they're no longer going to be within 10 feet of you, and you won't be able to apply that Spirit Shroud bonus damage. If we have an Elven Accuracy infused advantage attack roll on that 2nd attack, we should almost always land it, and thus very reliably push them away from us with our final attack of the round. Of course, we're applying Lance of Lethargy on the very first Eldritch Beam that lands, so they're now slowed by 10 feet. And then on subsequent turns, you just continue to do the same, but since you've got your bonus action available, hit them with your Tentacle of the Deeps first, then Eldritch Blast 1, Elven Accuracy Advantage Eldritch Blast 2, and push them. Now, thanks to the additional move speed reduction of your tentacle, their move speed is reduced by 20 feet. And you should be able to fairly consistently move up, make your attacks, move back a little bit on each turn, and keep them from ever actually being able to get up within melee range of you, even if they dash. And that is hilarious and awesome. Now, of course, this will all change drastically depending on the battlefield, your allies, your enemies, etc. You could run up to within 10 feet of 2 enemies, attack and push each of them, slowing one with Lance of Lethargy and the second with your tentacle attack. You could try to push an enemy away from another ranged ally to help keep them safe. You might decide that the battle's just going to go a whole lot more smoothly if you just cast Sleet Storm on a group of enemies instead and slow the ones that are stuck in it with your various attacks and push them further in if they're trying to get out. And if so, you should totally do that because control is really powerful in D&D. I'm just going to assume, for number crunching purposes, that we are doing the Spirit Shroud, Eldritch Blast, and Tentacle attacks just to discover what the potential of our DPR would be in a best case scenario, as always. This means that we would be doing 2 Eldritch Blast attacks for 1d10 plus 4 for Charisma plus 1d8 for Spirit Shroud each, and adding 1d8 for our Tentacle plus 1d8 for Spirit Shroud there, for a total of 2d10 plus 4d8 plus 8. And thus, against an enemy with a 10 armor class, we would do 37 damage per round on average, and against an enemy with a 15 armor class, it would be 31 DPR. And that's not bad. Compared to other sustained DPR builds that we've done to date, that's like bottom of tier 1, top of tier 2 by comparison at this level. In case you don't know, check the video description to see those comparisons and graphs and spreadsheets. And considering how much slowing and pushing we're doing to potentially multiple targets, I'd say that's downright peachy. And all this with nothing more than the power of snow and ice.
And force damage.
Mostly snow and ice. So, with what I considered the core of the build to be complete now, I wanted to take a second to read the description for this character that the team over at dScryb has come up with, since they are the sponsor for the video this week. The elvish warlock's face is nearly impossible to see, nestled as it is inside the fluffy ruff of a rime-encrusted hood atop a long, heavy robe. Pelting sleet falls from sudden conjured weather. Frost gathers on the warlock's shoulders. Frost runs along the robe's hem, as if a long relationship with the cold has formed the muffled incantation, the sleeves that crinkle as they rise, the ripple of fingers moving under thick mittens. From those hands, icy tentacles slither out through the storm. That is so good. They can really paint a picture with words, can't they, over at dScryb. So, for those who don't know, dScryb is a fantastic tool that players and DMs alike can use to get professionally written descriptions of almost anything you can imagine wanting a description for in a D&D game. Settings, characters, attacks, dialogue, spells, magic items, etc. And if the thing you want described hasn't already been written by them, you can request that they create something for you with a hero subscription, at least. But even with a free account, you can get access to thousands and thousands of easily searchable descriptions in their massive library that's growing every day. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I've known was coming for quite a while, but is finally here, and I'm super excited about. Character illustrations. dScryb has teamed up with some really fantastic artists so that you can now not only request a written description of your character, but can commission a beautifully illustrated portrait of them as well for a really reasonable price, with a lot of different options and price points to choose from. Black and white or full color with like a just bust version from the waist up, or a full body option as well. There are options to add a background to your portrait and even like a large pet or familiar. You guys, the work that these artists do is pretty spectacular. The samples that I've seen so far are gorgeous. You should absolutely check it out and consider commissioning a piece for your favorite hero or villain. So, when you visit dScryb, please be sure to use the URL dScryb.com/D4. I'll put a link to it in the video description. That way they know that I sent you. And if you decide to purchase a subscription so that you can get access to more content, be sure to use the code D4 at checkout for 10% off. Big thanks to dScryb. Let's get back to the build. At level 7, there's a big part of me that would really like to get some more sorcerer levels now. There's one spell in particular that I really want, but of course there are other benefits that sorcerer could provide. On the other hand, there's a lot of nice things waiting for us with more warlock levels too, and most of the good cold spells we want to boot. So I think I'm going to stick with warlock for a little bit longer here, though I can see you going sorcerer here if you really wanted to. But for us, we would be a warlock 6. And as a Fathomless warlock at level 6, we get Oceanic Soul, and that gives us resistance to cold damage, which felt pretty important thematically for this build, so I'm glad to finally get it. I mean, a Master Frost Mage shouldn't be affected by the cold, right? Or at least not as much. Ooh, and if you're fully submerged in water, any creature that is also fully submerged can understand you. I bet you use this a ton. Oh, stop being a jerk. Okay, there's more to Warlock 6 than that, because we also get Guardian Coil, which is a decent little defensive feature. When you or an ally within 10 feet of the tentacle takes damage, you can use your reaction to have the tentacle absorb 1d8 of that damage on one creature. It's not amazing. It's sort of like the Interception fighting style, but with reach and less damage absorption. I mean, sometimes just a few more hit points is going to be the difference between life and death, so we'll take it. But yeah, fine. Maybe Warlock 6 wasn't the best level ever, but there's more good stuff. Stick with me. At level 8, we would be a Warlock 7, and we get, first up, a 4th invocation. And I just had to have at least one more, because now we get to pick the Tome of Levistus invocation. And this is just like a must-have for this character, I think, thematically. With Tome of Levistus, once per short rest, as a reaction, when you take damage, you can encase yourself in ice. In ice. A frost mage indeed. It melts away at the end of your next turn, and you gain 10 temporary hit points per warlock level when you use this, which absorbs as much of the triggering damage as possible, probably all of the damage in the vast majority of cases, because that's 70 temporary hit points for us right now. Now, there is a downside. When you use this, you become vulnerable to fire damage, you can't move, and you are incapacitated. These effects, as well as the temporary hit points, all go away when the ice melts, which, like I said, is at the end of your next turn. So yeah, this is really just kind of a break glass in case of emergency type thing, because it's gonna make you miss a whole turn basically. But I mean, hey, it's a pretty nice card to pull out when like you're on the brink of death and maybe an ally could heal you or the enemy was about to kill you, but since you're covered in ice with 70 temporary hit points, they decide they're going to leave and go attack something else now. And again, thematically, it's just so on point. Also, as a Warlock 7, we get 4th level spells and spell slots now. Some really nice options: Banishment, Dimension Door, nothing that I'm going to plan on using for sustained DPR purposes, so PYF. At level 9, we would be a Warlock 8, and we get another ability score increase or feat. We really want to cap our charisma, I think, so we can improve both our spell hit, our spell save DC, and the damage applied to our icy eldritch blasts. And for our level 9 damage report then, not much has changed tactically, but we've increased our charisma and picked up mostly, thus far, some nice defensive and utility options. So, against an enemy with a 10 armor class, we would do 40 DPR on average, and against an enemy with a 16 armor class, it would be 34. Right, so not a lot better than last time we checked. Those last 3 levels were sort of the winter of our discontent. See what I did there? But it is about to see some really nice scaling, so hang tight. At level 10, we would be a Warlock 9, and we get 5th level spells. There are a lot of fun and powerful and even creepy 5th level spell options available to us, many of which don't do damage, so I think would be totally on the table, like Hold Monster, which I would maybe flavor as like freezing an enemy. But I'll just make special mention of Cone of Cold, which again is not available to most Warlocks, but is to the Fathomless. On the one hand, Cone of Cold is potentially the highest damage dealing multi-target area of effect spell in the game for 5th level. Potentially. It does 8d8 cold damage in a 60-foot cone, emanating from you, of course. And that's a pretty sizable area, and slightly more damage than even Fireball at 5th level would be. That, in and of itself, is pretty cool, pun intended, and means this spell is going to be worth having in your bag of tricks for sure, as it also fits perfectly with our theme. The biggest drawback, of course, is that instead of a dexterity saving throw or they take half damage, like with Fireball, it's a Constitution saving throw or they take half damage. And yes, that is generally the saving throw with the highest bonus for enemies in 5th edition, on average, which means that, on average, enemies are more likely to make their save than they would if we were forcing a dexterity saving throw instead, right? A little aside here. I think that we too often in the D&D community write off spells or abilities that target an enemy Constitution saving throw as being bad, without really thinking about it enough. Just because a spell or ability allows the enemy to make a Constitution saving throw doesn't make it inherently bad, right? Yes, on average, Constitution is the highest saving throw bonus that enemies in 5e have. That doesn't mean every enemy in D&D has a high Constitution saving throw, and so we should never use an ability or spell that targets Constitution, right? If you have a really powerful ability or spell that targets Constitution, just try to make sure that you have alternative spells or abilities that don't. Then you can pick and choose which arrow to pull out of your quiver based on the enemies you're fighting, based on the situation. This is particularly true of spells that do half damage if they succeed on a save. As I talked about a little bit in the Stars Druid build last week, where we were focused on Moonbeam, generally speaking, spells that still do half damage on a save are still pretty good at doing consistent damage. It does slightly more damage dice-wise at 5th level than a Fireball would, 8d8 versus 10d6, and has a slightly higher chance of being resisted. The average damage numbers actually come out pretty close. The real question is, why are you using a 5th level spell slot to cast Cone of Cold when you could be casting Wall of Force? It's because we don't have Wall of Force. And because sometimes you just need to do a lot of damage in a big area, okay? But also, I am mostly going to be using my 5th level spell slots to upcast Spirit Shroud anyway. Because yes, with Spirit Shroud, the damage, it only scales every 2 levels, right? With a 4th level spell slot, it did the same amount, but now with a 5th level spell slot, it does 2d8 damage on each hit. And that's quite nice. Also, the nice thing about being a warlock is you kind of don't have to feel guilty about using your high 5th level spell slots to upcast lower level spells, because they're the only spell slots we have. Everything is a 5th level spell, except for those lowly sorcerer spell slots. Don't worry, guys. We didn't forget about you. You are seen. We also do get a 5th invocation at this level, and while there are plenty of great ones, I think I'd probably take Eldritch Mind to have advantage on concentration checks. We do have Constitution saving throw proficiency, so now our concentration should be really well protected. At level 11, we'd be a Warlock 10, and first up, keep in mind that the damage that our tentacle deals and potentially absorbs defensively both go up from a 1d8 to a 2d8. So that's a nice little bit of scaling. Also, as a Fathomless Warlock, we get Grasping Tentacles, and that means we get to learn the Evard's Black Tentacles spell. We can cast it once per day without spending a spell slot, and when we do so, we receive temporary hit points equal to our Warlock level, and concentration on the spell can't be broken by damage. That is all amazing. The only problem is, the spell doesn't deal cold damage. Ouch. It's potentially a pretty good spell too, so you might just decide to use it anyway. Or maybe you can convince your DM to let it deal cold damage instead of bludgeoning damage. It basically makes a 20-foot cube filled with difficult terrain tentacles that both deal damage and potentially restrain targets that start their turn there or enter for the first time on a turn. I hate giving this up. If your DM won't let you convert the damage to cold, you could just be a sellout on your high standards and use the spell anyway. I don't know. It does require concentration, but it is like a more potent version of web. And especially if you're out of spell slots, could really come in handy, especially if you have the ability to push enemies back into it like we do. Worth considering. Don't forget, at level 11, our Eldritch Blast scales again, like all cantrips, up to 3 beams now. At level 12, we would be a Warlock 11. This is another big level for us. First up, we get finally a 3rd spell slot. And I think it's really hard to oversell how powerful this can be. No other class in the game gets 3 5th level spell slots until they're level 18 in a full caster class. And ours reset on a short rest. Now, sure, we don't have as many spell slots as those other full casters do, and that is a big deal. But having 3 5th level spell slots that reset on a short rest, really potent, and something that I really wanted to get to before we left Warlock behind. We also, at this level, get our first Mystic Arcanum, which is similar to having a 6th level spell slot, except that it's not a spell slot, meaning we can't use it to upcast lower level spells. We can just pick one 6th level spell and cast it once per day. It was really important for me to get here for this build because Warlocks do get access to the Investiture of Ice spell, and I kind of feel like this is the ultimate
I am the master of snow and ice
spell in the game. Mass Suggestion is probably a more powerful spell. It's fantastic control. Most optimizers might think you're crazy for taking Investiture of Ice instead, so I mean, feel free to go with something else. But if we're trying to create the ultimate Frost Mage, and we are, I think I have to get Investiture of Ice. It requires concentration, big bummer. It lasts 10 minutes though, that's nice, and then it covers your body in rime and ice when you cast it, and comes with a nice list of benefits, including, but not limited to, we're immune to cold damage and resistant to fire. The ground in a 10-foot radius around you is icy and difficult terrain for anyone but you. Also, you can use your action to throw out a 15-foot cone of cold damage that requires a Constitution save by anybody it hits, or the enemy takes 4d6 damage. 4d6? Ugh. But if they fail their save, their speed is halved until the start of our next turn, and then we can just reapply it, right? So I can see plenty of times where you really just want to be slowing down multiple enemies multiple times in a fight without throwing out a big area of effect sleet storm because it might disrupt what your allies are trying to do, right? And in that case, this could potentially really come in handy. The damage is pretty subpar, but if you coupled the half move speed with the move penalty penalty from your tentacle whip that you could use still with your bonus action, you could really lock down a lot of enemies and continue to do so round after round with very little resource expenditure. But at level 13, now that we have our 6th level Arcanum spell and our 3rd spell slot, I think it's probably time to leave Warlock behind and go back to Sorcerer. I could see taking one more level in Warlock to get that ability score increase or feat and yet another invocation too. But more than anything with this build right now, I'm craving some of the utility and versatility that we could get from Sorcerer, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to crazy damage scaling, which admittedly staying with Warlock wouldn't really have done either if we're just limiting ourselves to cold damage. So yes, at this point, we have learned all that we could from our Silver Dragon Sea Elf ancestor. And it's time to learn and grow and draw upon our power without additional assistance from them. It's time to spread our draconic wings and fly, as it were. So at Sorcerer 2, we get Font of Magic, we get our sorcery points. Currently, those can only be used to convert sorcery points into spell slots, and we get 1 sorcery point per level in Sorcerer, and they reset on a short rest. We'll be getting meta magic to spend those points on next level, but before we get to that, we need to do another damage report for level 13. We've seen a lot of nice increases to our damage since last check. Spirit Guardians has scaled up to 2d8. We have another beam when we use Eldritch Blast. The damage of our Tentacle of the Deeps has increased as well. And of course, we've picked up some nice defense and utility options. And so, against an enemy with a 10 armor class, we would do 78 DPR on average. And against an enemy with a 17 armor class, it would be 63 damage on average. And that is almost double our damage since last we checked, which feels much, much better. Compared to other sustained DPR builds at this level, that's near the top of tier 2. Very nice. At level 14, we would be a Sorcerer 3, and we get meta magic options. So I love meta magic. You get to choose 2 different options to spend your sorcery points on to enhance your spells in a variety of really awesome ways. My favorite, as many of you probably know, tends to be Quickened Spell, and I think I would take it for this build as well. I just love being able to spend a couple of sorcery points and then cast a spell that normally has a casting time of 1 action as a bonus action. And especially if we're often using our action for a cantrip like Eldritch Blast, that's particularly great because we could do both, right? We could cast a spell as a bonus action with Quicken Spell and then still use a cantrip for our action. So we could now say throw down a Sleet Storm with a bonus action and then Eldritch Blast 1 or 2 or even 3 enemies into the area of effect, potentially knocking them prone and really getting them stuck. The other option I think I would take here would probably be Twinned Spell. It wouldn't work with Eldritch Blast, as the spell that you twin can't be capable of targeting more than 1 enemy, but you could say twin Ray of Frost for 1 little sorcery point and hit and slow 2 enemies if you needed to, since we can only slow 1 target per turn with Eldritch Blast and Lance of Lethargy, remember. And then with a bonus action, Tentacle Whip a 3rd, so that's 3 enemies slowed now, potentially. Alternatively, I can see you taking like Transmuted Spell. That would let you take a spell that does another elemental damage type, right? Fire, poison, acid, lightning, thunder, and change it to cold. I kind of said at the beginning how just going Scribe's Wizard so you could change everything to cold damage was sort of cheating, and this kind of maybe would be too. But if there's a spell out there that you really want to transmute from another elemental damage type, Scorching Ray really comes to mind, I think. Or there might be a sorcerer spell that you get later that you'd like to transmute, so that's an option. But speaking of sorcerer spells, yes, we do get 2nd level sorcerer spells here. And while there are plenty of good ones to choose from, the one that I want to focus on, indeed, the one that might have been the primary motivator for me to leave Warlock behind, is Rhyme's Binding Ice. So this spell is new to us from Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. And if there hadn't been so many great things from Warlock that I really wanted, I would have tried, I think, to go Sorcerer 3 before anything to get this spell. I mean, it's not that it's so amazingly powerful, though it is good, but it's just so unique, I think, and fun and perfectly on point for this build. Rhyme's Binding Ice, an action to cast, and then it shoots out a 30-foot cone, which is a pretty decent area of effect, especially for a 2nd level spell. Each creature hit by it has to make a Constitution saving throw, but if they fail it, they take 3d8 damage. Again, not bad for a 2nd level spell. More importantly, if they fail their save, their move speed is reduced to 0 for 1 minute. They don't get to make another saving throw to break out if they fail the first. It can only be broken if they or another creature spend their turn breaking them out of the ice, right? They're not restrained, it's more like you've grappled them from a distance. And since this doesn't require our concentration, that's potentially really strong. This, coupled with the other slowing and snaring options that we have, just really makes us kind of the master of freezing and sticking and slowing our targets in place, and I love it. Another spell worth considering, I think, would be Vortex Warp. This is new from the Strixhaven book. It lets you teleport even an unwilling creature, if they fail, yes, a Constitution saving throw, up to 90 feet away. So if your Eldritch Blast push isn't enough to get them inside the area of your Sleet Storm, for example, but you really want them in there, this would be a potential way to try and make that happen. At level 15, we would be a Sorcerer 4, and we get another ability score increase or feat. The reality is there are still a lot of feats that I would like on this build. I mean, Resilient Wisdom, of course, especially with our low wisdom score. Moderately Armored would be worth considering. I mean, we'd get proficiency in medium armor and shields, plus 1 to our dexterity or strength. This would especially be worth considering if we would have planned for it at the beginning and had an odd number dexterity score, I think. But, I mean, how have we gotten this far in a cold damage only build without Elemental Adept? You probably should have gotten this feat sooner. I would say if you're anticipating seeing a lot of cold resistant enemies in this campaign, then yes, for sure, take it sooner. Maybe even as your first feat, as it lets you ignore cold resistance and also treats any 1s that you roll for cold damage as 2s. Not a big bump, but better than leaving them at 1s, right? So yeah, let's take Elemental Adept unless you're confident that you're just not going to have to deal with cold resistance, in which case I'd probably go Resilient Wisdom. At level 16, we'd be a Sorcerer 5, and we get 3rd level Sorcerer spells. Lots of fantastic options, none that I'm going to talk about because I think I'm going long, so pick your favorites. And finally, at level 17, we'd be a Sorcerer 6. Eldritch Blast goes up to 4 beams now, which is so good. And then, as a Draconic Sorcerer at level 6, we get Elemental Affinity, which is one of the main reasons why I wanted to take Draconic Bloodline as my subclass all those levels ago, even though we didn't get this feature until the very end. With Elemental Affinity, when you cast a spell that deals for us cold damage, right, you can add your Charisma modifier to 1 damage roll of that spell. This is most potent if, say, you're doing Cone of Cold and hitting multiple enemies, since with those kinds of spells, you're just rolling damage once and adding that damage to every enemy, so you'd get to add your Charisma modifier to every enemy. But it's not bad even for a single target spell like Ray of Frost or whatever. Now, my question is, how would it interact with Spirit Shroud? Do you only get to add this Charisma modifier once for the entire duration of the spell? So the first time you hit someone with Spirit Shroud, the damage gets a bonus, but never again while the spell lasts? That seems silly, but it might be rules as written. I'm going to assume that we can add the damage once per turn because I have to believe that that's how the vast majority of tables would rule it, but you may disagree. That's fine. If it doesn't work that way at your table, reduce the numbers I'm about to present by a little bit. So yes, for our final damage report at level 17, we've added a 4th beam to our Eldritch Blasts, an extra helping of our Charisma modifier to 1 of those attacks thanks to Elemental Affinity, and a teeny tiny bump from Elemental Adept, plus some really great additional control and utility options. And so, against an enemy with a 10 armor class, we would do on average 104 DPR. And against an enemy with an 18 armor class, it would be 84 damage per round. I can't believe it. We broke the Centennial Barrier, at least at low ACs. Something that I really didn't think that we'd be doing with this build when I started building it. And that puts us comfortably in the middle of tier 2 compared to other sustained DPR builds that I've done at this level. And so, final thoughts. The tier score for this character, when you average all the damage at all the armor classes at all of the levels that we calculated them for, is 54. And that puts them kind of in the middle of tier 2 compared to other DPR builds, which is really solid. And I guess I'll just say that, like every single character, I suppose, but maybe more than most, I love this build. I love the feel of this build more than anything. I love what we were able to accomplish by just sticking to like a very narrow character concept. All this slowing and snaring just feels to me like it does exactly what you would want a Frost Mage build to do. And that's my favorite thing about it. But when you add to that the fact that it can put out some pretty significant sustainable damage, it just makes me love it that much more. Now, admittedly, the control that we're bringing is not necessarily like the super hard control that you might get from things like Wall of Force, right? Or even Fear Spell or Hypnotic Pattern, etc. Things that the Enchanter Wizard, the Control Freak build, do I have any cards left? Anyway, that's what that build was focused on, really hard shutdown control. This is a little softer, right? As a result, I think would shine best in a party that wasn't filled with tons of melee allies. Preventing enemies from getting into range to attack you is great, but if your friends are just rushing up to meet them anyway, it's a lot less effective. Obviously, that's something to discuss with your friends in a session 0 as you talk about your characters, what your tactics are going to be, etc. But if you can all be on the same page, coordinating attacks against some while you freeze and push and slow others to keep them out of the fight until your party's ready for them, this build would be incredibly powerful, I think, and more importantly, an absolute blast to play. And I hope I get to do so one day in game sometime. But that's the build for the week. I love you guys so much. You're the best. Thank you for watching and for subscribing and liking and considering joining the channel as a member. I hope you have a great week. I hope you have a great day. I hope to see you again very soon. But more importantly, I hope that you're happy and good and kind and that you stay safe. Okay, until next time. Bye. You're as cold as ice. You're willing to sacrifice our love. Actually, the song I should be singing here is something from Frozen, right? I just don't know if I do a great Elsa impression. And you should be able to fairly effectively. You should be able to end. Let it go. Let it go. Don't hold it back anymore. Let it go, let it go. Turn away and slam the door. That's cold. Seems fitting. You could just be a spell out. A spell out. That's good. Okay, I'm recording. That's not right. Is that right? I don't think that's right. Let me say that. Boom. Meta magic point, or not. Don't say that. Don't even say that. Don't even say any of that. Between being able to pick up some additional defensive abilities while also not breaking dishes in the sink.